everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Tariff Trends 2025, Expert Insights on the New U.S. Customs Landscape. My name is Jenn Park, and I'm the Director of the Trade Advisory team here at Flexport. We have a great webinar for you today, but before we begin, let's cover a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located at the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A on the sidebar. Time permitting at the end of the presentation, we will answer a few audience questions. Be sure to get your questions in early. In the menu above your screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck, and in the second tab is a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We love your feedback, so please fill that out before exiting the webinar. Now, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all information provided during this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Joining me today is my colleague, Robert Kossick, Senior Trade Advisory Associate. Here is today's agenda. It's going to be a lighter update today. We will review first with starting with the IEEPA tariff update since our last webinar. We'll go into the latest Section 232 tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs, and then we will close out with how to prepare for the tariffs and a Q&A. So let's jump right in. All right, the last webinar that we had conducted was held on February 6th, so it was when IEEPA tariffs became effective, and we wanted to present the slide once again just to kind of give you an update on where we stand with IEEPA. Since then, we know that February 7th, the day after the webinar, the President issued an amendment to the executive order that allows China origin goods to be imported via de minimis until the Secretary of Commerce notifies the President that adequate systems are in place to fully and exponentially collect tariffs. So one thing to note is that the China tariffs are still in effect. I know that's a question a lot of companies had, is that does this suspension delay the tariffs in addition to de minimis? But no, the tariffs are in effect today. So you'll see that any goods coming in from China will have that additional 10% tariff. But one thing to note is that de minimis is suspended. So any China origin goods that were previously coming through the de minimis program, that's still available and eligible for de minimis until further notice. It's really uncertain at this time how long it's going to take until de minimis comes back. We do get this question a lot. Is it going to be days? Is it going to be weeks? Is it going to be months? Obviously, it's hard to tell at this time, but we know that the U.S. Secretary, Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, was confirmed by Senate this week. So he will be prioritized in terms of figuring out what's going to happen with the de minimis program. So I think if we figure out, depending on how soon he is able to set up the process, we're going to be able to get the exclusions for de minimis on China origins good back, but it's really uncertain at this time in terms of the timeline. All right. We can go into Section 232 tariffs. I think this is the latest tariff update that came out once the IEEPA tariffs came into play. We wanted to kind of go through a history of the Section 232 tariffs before we go into the updates. So Section 232 is trade restrictions on certain commodities to protect the national security. This was implemented during the first Trump administration, so it was effective June 1st of 2018, still is today. Since then, there have been developments in terms of the scope of which countries were exempted, which products were excluded, but it is something that is still in place, so it's not a completely new tariff. We know that previously there was a 25% on imported steel and 10% on imported aluminum. And we did list some of the exclusions, so the exempted countries here. You see that Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, even Mexico were exempted from these tariffs. And then next, we kind of wanted to go into the February 2025 update. So like I mentioned, these tariffs were in place for the past 4 years. And one thing we wanted to note is what is changing from what was previously assessed and what the current proclamation announced on February 10th will cover. And so It actually expands the scope of the aluminum and steel tariffs. We know that any products of aluminum and steel from any country will be assessed at 25%. In addition to that, what we see is that there is a derivative product of aluminum and steel that will now be assessed the 25% again. In the next slide, we can kind of go through in detail about the nuances and the details of which classifications will be impacted. But just wanted to call out that, this is something that was previously in place. Now that we're going to see that there's going to be some broader scope changes. All right. If we want to go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So we wanted to kind of outline what was outlined in the Federal Register. We know that the proclamation came out, and then there was a list, an annex that was provided by the proclamation that also lists all the classifications that were going to be impacted. And so from that, there was a Federal Register that was published, and we wanted to kind of highlight what are the key changes that you'll see in terms of how it will impact your products and your classifications. As you can see on the steel side, there's about 155 HTS classifications in Chapter 73 that will get the 25% tariffs on the total value of the goods. So these are finished goods, and they will get the 25% on the entire value of the finished good. The second is the steel derivative. So this is something new. And if it's outside of the Chapter 73, there's about 12 HTS classifications that were listed in the annex under Chapter 84 and 94. And these will get the additional 25% on the steel content as well. Something to note here is that this is on the steel content, not on the total value of the finished good. All right, next one is the aluminum tariffs. We know that previously it was at 10%. We see that now it's going to be increasing to 25% on the total value of the goods, except Russia will get that 200%. Also here is the aluminum derivatives. So if it's outside Chapter 76, there's about 104 HTS classifications that were listed, and these will get a 25% on the aluminum content. Once again, this is the content, not on the total value of the finished good. All right. At this time, it's uncertain how customs will collect information on the steel content or the value of the aluminum content. So it could be a bill of materials, but they're charged with providing information to the public in terms of what information they will be requesting in order to confirm that the finished goods that's coming in has an aluminum or steel content in it, and what that value is going to, how that value is going to be assessed in terms of the tariffs. So there's more information coming at this time for in the future, but we just know that this is something that's going to need to be provided by the importer in order to understand how they're going to assess the tariffs on the content of just aluminum and steel. All right. Something to note for the both of these Section 232s on aluminum and steel is that it will eliminate any product exclusions, country exemptions, and quota agreements. So as you saw on the previous slide, there were a few countries that are currently exempted from the tariffs, Canada, Mexico included. Those exemptions will be going away effective February 11th, and there will be no drawback allowed on these tariffs. Products that are excluded from these tariffs are, steel that's melted and poured in the U.S., or aluminum that's smelted and cast in the U.S. and then exported to another country to become a finished good and then re-imported. So if the smelting, pouring, and the casting happens here in the U.S., those will be exempted from the tariffs. And one thing to note is that we are going to see greater CBP enforcement. What is outlined in the proclamations is that if there are any misclassifications that result in tariff evasion, so if you accidentally or unintentionally have a misclassification where your products now fall outside of one of the HTS classifications that are subject to the tariffs, and CBP happens to find that, it is possible that you will get the maximum penalty without any mitigating factors being considered. So it is going to be very important that you take this seriously, making sure that the classifications on your products are accurate so that you are paying the right tariffs and that there is no intention of evading these tariffs. Also, what's outlined in the proclamation is that the Department of Commerce is also directed that within 90 days, that they not only put up a process or develop a process for assessing the tariffs on these classifications, but also they also have the ability to add any additional products to the list of, aluminum or steel tariffs and product derivatives. So it is possible that the list that's currently that's listed in the annex that you saw in the Federal Register notice could increase in the number of classifications that are going to be within scope. So that's something that we will keep an eye on and provide an update once we hear more. All right. And then I'll hand it off to Robert, who's going to talk about reciprocal tariffs.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Thanks for that good update on 232s. And good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Jen mentioned, my name is Robert Kossick, and I am an advisor with the Trade Advisory Group at Flexport. I'll be taking us through the other big development, the other big tariff development that came down from the Trump administration since the time of the last webinar. And that involves basically the publication of a memo that lays the foundation for the imposition of a measure that's designed to counter non-reciprocal trade arrangements by determining the equivalent of a reciprocal tariff with respect to each foreign trading partner. Essentially, reciprocal tariffs. And the name that's identified in this memo is the Fair and Reciprocal Plan. To this end, the goals that are articulated in the memo entail addressing trade deficits and unfair trade practices with an eye to rebuilding the U.S. industrial base, opening up export markets, and enhancing national security. In framing the rationale this way, I think it's clear that the Trump administration is looking at some of the tariff differentials that you see in the infographics, some of the infographics on the screen there. As you can, I'm assuming you can see that, it might be too small. I hope it's not. But those tariff differentials can either be sharp, and I'm thinking, for example, about India, 17% versus the United States, which has, an average tariff of 3.3%. South Korea 13%, Brazil 11%. Those can be quite sharp. On the other hand, they might not be that sharp. For example, the differential you see between the U.S. and Canada, or the U.S. and the U.K., or the U.S. and the European Union. So, this is what I think the Trump administration is looking at when they came up with and articulated this measure. Next slide, please, Carol. In terms of the foreign practices or measures that can open the door to reciprocal tariffs, the memo casts a wide net, and these issues or considerations are laid out in the screen here. You can see actually they refer to it as a comprehensive scope. This can include tariff imbalances, where the administration determines that there's an inappropriate tariff imbalance. An example would include for India with its automobiles. The tariffs on U.S. automobiles can be as high as 70% going into India, whereas by way of contrast, we only have about a 2.5% duty on equivalent vehicles coming into the United States. It could involve discriminatory taxes, and there's an explicit call out to the value-added tax in the European Union, for example, but not just there. You see VATs and EVAs throughout Latin America as well. This has been a long-running source of controversy between the United States and countries that impose VATs. So it's not surprising to see it find its way into this memo. NTBs, which are non-tariff barriers and otherwise burdensome regulatory requirements. This can include regulations that are designed to protect the health, safety, welfare of people with respect to food, for people or the environment. It could be the environment, it could be food, it could be cosmetics, drugs, devices. But the various regulatory requirements that come into play when you're bringing those goods into a country can be very burdensome, very difficult to satisfy, and in effect serve as a trade barrier. Labeling requirements, licensing requirements. things of the type that are fleshed out in the USTR's annual foreign trade barrier report. So if you want to know more about foreign trade barriers, you can always go to the USTR and get that report. Unfair trade practices is called out in the memo. This is essentially, and they specifically mention subsidies, which makes me immediately think of China and the allegations that we have and the investigations that we have into Chinese subsidies. So it appears that that's on the radar. Wage suppression and non-market driven exchange rate policies. This would go to policies that are implemented by a foreign country, which are designed to keep wages low, thereby giving their industries a comparative advantage with respect to, the way things work in the United States and labor rates and the cost of production here. And non-specified mercantilist policies, anything that's restrictive in terms of trade. As far as how this will work, the memo sketches out a rough process. This essentially involves the delivery of reports, the reports that are called for in the earlier memorandum from earlier in February, the America First Trade Policy Memorandum. If you go back and look at that, that memo calls for a series of reports to be prepared by the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, the Secretary of the Treasury, as well as some other agencies. These reports are due April 1st, according to the memo for the Fair and Reciprocal Plan. April 1st, that's coming up quickly. At that point, the United States Trade Representative and the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with Treasury, Homeland Security, and other executive branch officers, will investigate any harm. They're going to do their own investigation and propose remedies to the president, which can then be put into action. So there's no deadline that's given in the memo. I think that's important to underscore. Depending on the authority that is relied upon, after they do their investigation, they propose their remedies, they'll rely on different authorities they can rely on. And depending on which authority they do rely on, that can either result in a very fast process or a slow process, because some of these authorities have different built-in requirements, investigations and notifications and things like that, comments processes. So it can either be fast or slow depending on how they go. And we are hearing anecdotally through unattributed sources in the press, essentially, that the administration is encouraging bilateral negotiations during this intervening time period. So between now and the time that the reports are due on April 1st, and then again as the investigations are being conducted, it's the administration's expectation that foreign countries will engage in a negotiation process with the United States, which makes it sound sort of similar to what we saw playing out with the IEPAs with Canada and Mexico. I'm not saying that's going to happen for a fact, but it just kind of feels like we're moving in that direction. And Congress, there's a bill in Congress that was recently introduced, the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Act, which is designed, if it's passed, it will give the president express authority to engage in exactly that type of negotiation. So I think that that would facilitate those bilateral negotiations. Next slide, please, Carol. So at this juncture, there are a couple of gaps that remain in the overall reciprocal tariff picture. They're identified here on the screen. The first one I think that's worth calling out is that there is no specific authority that's been specified in the memo. Unlike the earlier memos and proclamations regarding TIEPAs, there were very specific linkages to statutory authority for the measure or the action. That was not that's not the case here. I think the administration is keeping its cards close to its vest. I think it likes to kind of preserve that element of unpredictability from a negotiating perspective. And as I just mentioned, the comprehensive scope of what could come into play with these reciprocal tariffs is such that it could open the door to reliance on a broad range of authorities, not just one, as was the case with IEPA. And it could be any number of things. going to the Trade Act of 1974, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the Tariff Act of 1930, the IEPAs. I think all options are on the table based on how wide a net they've cast in terms of the issues they're looking at with reciprocal tariffs. The other thing that's worth pointing out, I think, is that the tariff calculation mechanics are unclear. When you read the memo, you don't know whether this is going to be an across-the-board tariff applied on all products of a single country, which would be significantly simpler to implement, or conversely, whether this is going to be a measure that's applied on a product-by-product basis for countries, which would make it a significantly more difficult measure to implement and manage, both from the government side as well as from the trade side. I think the key thing to keep in mind is that we're early in the process here. I view this memo and the issues that it's flagging as kind of a shot across the bow. This is a developing story. It's basically putting the world on alert that this is what the administration is thinking, and these are the issues that it's concerned about. It is a developing story, and I think that more details are to come in the weeks and months ahead. Next slide, please. Okay. So finally, let's take a look at potential ramifications that could flow from this measure. I think there are a couple that are worth pointing out. The first one is that these measures, to the extent that they could be construed as being WTO inconsistent, could lead to a filing of challenges at the World Trade Organization. I think the significance of this possibility is reduced somewhat by the way that the dispute settlement body and mechanism at the World Trade Organization has been essentially sidelined by U.S. action over the last couple of years. So yes, in theory, that's an option, and there are countries that might go down that way, but I don't think it's going to have any direct implications or ramifications for the United States. I think the more likely result is that countries take matters into their own hands and retaliate, and there's lots of precedent for this. We saw this in the last last Trump administration. There were retaliations, and and countries are talking about this, not just in this context with these prospective reciprocal tariffs, but with IEPAs and others. And I think on a more proximal level, that these measures, if they're implemented, would increase import duties, restrict export opportunities to the extent that countries retaliate, and make it more difficult for American producers to send their goods abroad, increase bond premiums, raise levels of transactional uncertainty, and increase compliance risk. And finally, I think that depending on how this plays out, and again, we're early in the process, we don't know how this is going to go, but it could potentially even lead to reshoring, which I think is a preferred outcome on the part of the Trump administration. So with that, let me hand this back over to Jen, who's going to start the discussion on how to prepare for potential tariffs.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight three main things that importers or companies should be focusing on with the new tariffs, especially the steel tariffs coming into play within IEPA currently in effect for China. So one thing we wanted to make sure that we call out is customs bonds. A question did come up several times in our Q&A in terms of, are these 25% tariffs for the steel and aluminum in addition to the IEPA 10%? So if you have products coming in from China that are already assessed that, Section 301, 10% on the IEPA, is this another 25% on top of that, or does it replace that? So the way that the proclamation is stated is that it's in addition to any duties and taxes. So this is going to be cumulative. So what's going to be very important is making sure that if, as an importer, you do have an active bond on file, but also a bond that will be able to cover all the additional duties and tariffs for the upcoming year. The way that you assess the bond amount is that it should be 10% of your annual duty liability. So if you anticipate that you're going to be paying additional tariffs, whether it's IEEPA, whether it's the 25% on steel, you want to make sure you take a really good look in terms of whether you need to increase your bond. The last thing you want is that you're bond stacking. So what happens is that if you think that you're only going to need, a $50,000 bond, and it turns out that 6 months in, you're really getting close to that limit, you're going to be saturating your bond. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be a mandated increase where your surety asks for a new bond or an increase in your bond. And what will ultimately happen is that there's going to be bond stacking. You're going to have additional collateral. There's going to be bond premiums. So you just want to avoid that. So I would say if you're close to your annual bond renewal, consider all the different tariffs that may come into play for your business for this year before determining whether you need to get an increase in your bond, which you most likely will. And you want to kind of assess that very carefully. Another one is for e-commerce. I know this is something that we discussed last time, but it is something that's very important. So if you are a company that's switching from de minimis to now formal or informal entries because your products are no longer eligible, you want to make sure that you understand what information is going to be required on an informal entry. In addition to classification, making sure you're using the right value, but there's additional data elements that's going to be required. And you just want to make sure that you're in a very good position to supply all of that information so it does not, cause any customs delays. But also things to consider is, do you want to change how you import? Do you want to import in bulk in order to save on freight? Or do you want to set up some fulfillment centers so that it makes it easier for you to ship goods directly to your customers? Are there Incoterms that are more beneficial for your company when you switch over to formal and informal entries? So those are things that you want to, take into consideration for companies that are switching from de minimis to formal informal, because it's going to be a very different process. And we would always recommend working with your brokers to understand what those additional requirements are going to be and how you can best set up your practice so that, you are ultimately getting the best duty savings. Another thing to call out is any HTS classifications or country of origin reviews. It's very critical right now where CBP has increased their enforcement in terms of reviewing entries, making sure that you are paying the right tariffs, but also the country of origin of your goods. So, we've seen an increase in CF 28s, 29s being issued by customs in terms of anti-dumping reviews, the tariffs on 301s, but I think ultimately what we want to make sure as you as an importer is that the information that you declare to customs, you want to make sure it's as accurate as possible so that you are paying the right tariffs. So I would say first start with classification, country of origin, and valuation. Those are the three data elements that will drive your duty and tariffs. So those are the three elements that customs will be really focusing on. So HTS classification obviously is something that we always say should be reviewed annually at the minimum to make sure that the classification is correct, because that's going to drive what duty you pay, what tariffs are going to be assessed on your products at import. And I will say we always review classifications for companies who's been around, who's used the same classification for years. And, there's a lot of positive stories that we find in terms of finding misclassifications that ultimately result in, duty refunds. So that's another opportunity that you can look into as well. But, that's always making sure that you're not only in compliance, but also a way where you can potentially strive for duty savings for your products. All right. And I'll hand it off to Robert for any additional duty savings or opportunities that, Flexport may be able to assist with.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate that. In terms of identifying duty saving opportunities and mitigating tariffs, there's basically a two-part strategy that I think that can be followed. The first involves understanding your supply chain and your import fundamentals. There are a couple of things that can be done to address that. First of all is do an ACE analysis. Get into ACE, download the reports, review the data that's in there. Look at the trends that you see, look at the allocations, look at the price points, the cost points. Look at it from the point of view of seeing if there are any cost-saving opportunities that jump out at you. Look at it from the point of view of seeing whether there are any kind of compliance risk exposures that are in there. So that's an incredibly useful tool for understanding kind of where you are in a historical perspective. You can go back a couple of years, and that information is right there. which can also be looked at in conjunction with your own internal records. The second thing, and under the first part of the strategy, which is, again, understanding your supply chain and import fundamentals, is conducting a reasonable care review. A little bit of overlap here with what Jen was just talking about, but essentially check those classifications. Are they correct? Have they changed? Has something changed in them? Is there risk there? Are there costs there? Are there savings opportunities there? You don't know until you really drill down and carefully check. Same thing with origin. Origin is complicated, knowing that you have the right country of origin. And, it's the classification in conjunction with the origin that's going to drive so many of the outcomes in terms of knowing whether these different tariffs, not just the reciprocal tariffs, the 232s, the IEPAs, or any others that might come down the pike, but it's going to be the classification and the origin usually that's going to be determinative as to how that's going to play out. So you need to make sure you have a good grasp on the country of origin. Don't just simply rely on what your supplier is telling you. Do your own homework. Go and verify. Go to the foreign production facility. Verify that they actually have a plant there and they actually have the equipment there that's needed to do the thing that you're making, and that they actually have the ability and the team and the manpower, the headcount to do these things. Same thing with value, same concept. And, kind of when you think about reasonable care, you're essentially talking about classification, origin, and value. Look carefully at the valuations that are being, they're being negotiated and transacted and then reported as reflected in documents and invoices. Make sure that you take into account the assists that could come into play, or the royalties or things of that nature, the packaging, the freight, whatever it might be. Make sure that you've got it properly accounted for and that you're reporting accurate values. And then thirdly, on the first part of the strategy, again, is clarify any doubts you have. Consult with a trade expert. If that doesn't solve the problem, consider going and getting a binding ruling. They're out there. But resolve any uncertainty that you have as you conduct these reviews, and when you look at your data and you look at your processes. If there are doubts, address them. Don't just assume, oh well, we don't know the answer, but it won't come back to haunt us. It very well could. So in terms of the second part of the strategy, for identifying duty saving opportunities and mitigating tariffs, that is basically to define and be prepared to implement a duty mitigation strategy. These measures are in place now, or they're coming. The administration is taking action, or they're letting you know that they're taking action. So if you're going to do something about it, now's the time to have that conversation with a trade expert. Again, review your internal data and figure out how you're potentially affected by this, and if you are, what you're going to do about it. And this is this part. And to that end, there are a bunch of measures that can be taken to offset the adverse effect of some of these tariffs. For example, you can take post-entry corrective or challenge actions. That's basically not leaving money on the table. If there's an error in it, file that post-summary correction. Or if you didn't claim preferential treatment and you were entitled to, you were eligible for it, make that post-importation claim. Or if customs issues makes an administrative decision that you disagree with, challenge it via protest. These are all steps that you can take which could benefit your bottom line. Secondly, conduct operational engineering. If you have a production process that was essentially in one place, but you can isolate out one step, the step that gives rise to the essential character or confers the substantial transformation, look into it and see if there's a way of pulling that particular step out of the equation and putting it somewhere else so as to be able to confer a different origin. Tariff engineering. Look at your products. It's not available. It doesn't work with all products, but for some it does. Is there a way of rethinking the product in a way that moves a pocket or changes the material, which has the effect then of moving that tariff classification into a more a less burdensome tariff rate? These things are possible, but you have to look into them. Explore the possibility of using free trade agreements or trade preference programs. when they're available. AGOA, for example. We have a fairly robust network of free trade agreements. There are requirements for claiming eligibility under them, but look into them to the extent that makes sense. I mean, it could be that it hasn't happened yet with Canada or Mexico, but who knows what's going to happen? It could be that developments relating to IEPA change that calculus for FTAs. We're in a very fluid environment, and I think you're going to really have to go tariff by tariff, measure by measure, country by country, and conducting these types of analyses. Same thing with drawback. Consider drawback to the extent that it's still on the table. So drawback has been eliminated in certain with respect to certain tariff measures. It's unclear how it's going to apply in the context of reciprocal tariffs. But look into it. Same thing with the first sale doctrine, foreign trade zones, exclusions if they're available. In the past Trump administration, there were exclusion processes for the 301s and the 232s. Those have gone away with China on the IEPAs. But it's worth looking into to see if there's something that might be there. If your goods are subject to anti-dumping, countervailing duties, consider challenging the scope. Does your good really, look at it carefully? Does your good really come within the parameters of that scope or not? There are challenges that can be raised to look at that. And then finally, as mentioned before, there's always the possibility of reshoring, which is again my read personally is I think this is what the Trump administration would like to see, have as many companies come back. So yeah, with that, that's what I have. Thank you.
All right. I know we're past time, but we will stay on for just a few more minutes to do some Q&As because I know a lot of our attendees do appreciate the Q&A sessions. So I'll go through some of the questions, try to answer those very quickly. For those that we don't get to, we will try to reach out and get those answers to you via email. I have a question where it says, have they listed the HTS codes for steel aluminum products? So there is an annex that lists all of the classifications that are going to be impacted by the 25% aluminum and steel tariffs in addition to the derivatives. So, we can send that over to you. It's in the Federal Register notice as well. Please know, as I indicated earlier in the session, that the Department of Commerce does have 90 days to take a review to potentially add additional products to that list. So it could change, but there is at least a list that has been published with that list of the classifications that will be impacted. Another one on classification is that for the IEPA 10% tariffs on Chinese goods, a question came in. So for the earlier 10% tariff on Chinese goods, it's for all articles of product of China and Hong Kong, regardless of the HTS code, correct? Or is there a forthcoming list of HTS codes that the 10% will be applied to? So for the IEPA 10% tariffs for China, Hong Kong origin goods, that applies to all products. So it's not HTS or product specific. It's just a 10% across all goods coming in with that country of origin. All right. There was one on reciprocal tariffs that, are there any countries that are specifically excluded from reciprocal tariffs? Our focus is on Israel. Robert, do you have any insight there?
Not any concrete insight. The memo specifies that these reviews are going to focus, they're going to evaluate the possibility of imposing the equivalent of a reciprocal tariff with respect to each foreign trading partner. That's a direct quote from the memo. So I think my read of that is, that's not saying this is applicable to everybody, but my read is that they're going to analyze the situation, the bilateral differential situation on a country by country basis, and make their decisions accordingly. So what happens if you're a country where your tariff rates are below the United States? That would seem to suggest that you want to be hit with reciprocal tariffs, right? But on the other hand, the scope of what they're looking at in the fair and reciprocal plan is so broad that maybe it's not just about an imbalance in the tariffs, but maybe the administration's not happy with what they're seeing with wage suppression or non-tariff barriers. So just simply by virtue of being in a situation where a country has a lower average tariff rate than the United States, I don't think that's going to give you grounds for feeling like you're out of this altogether. But this is going to be determined, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then One question that has come up multiple times, I think I answered when I was discussing the customs bonds, was that for the steel tariffs, is that on top of the 25% and the 10% for China imports? Like I mentioned, these are cumulative, so it's an addition. So you will see that the tariffs will be stacking. So if you are paying Section 301 tariffs and then the 10% tariffs for China goods and the steel, if your goods are from China, you will see the 25% tariffs on top of that. So unfortunately, it's in addition to the previous tariffs. I'll take one more. It says, does it mean that there are more chances that goods will be held at customs due to customs teams reviewing the aluminum steel content information more attentively and calling out if they miss any information? So, like I mentioned, there is going to be greater CBP enforcement in general, especially for products coming into China, because they want to ensure that the right tariffs are being paid. And so we do see that this will probably lead to more reviews from customs for these type of products, especially if they fall within a 232, 301, or IEPA. It's unclear at this time what information CBP is going to request in order to confirm what is that steel content, aluminum content, that for an importer to prove that only this portion of their finished good, is going to be subject to those tariffs. We will see more in terms of customs probably publishing more information to importers on what that information request is going to look like and what information needs to be supplied. But in general, I do think that there's going to be an increase in reviews from customs as it applies to products that are going to be now subject to these additional tariffs.
Let me add one thing to that, Jen, too. I think that you're going to see stepped up scrutiny in the context of processing that takes place in third countries, too. So if you have a steel or aluminum derivative article which stops along the way and something happens to it, I think that situation you just see in the legislation that's out there, and you see in what CBP is doing. You can definitely see a stepped up focus on that third country processing. So I'd be careful with that too. Make sure you really understand what's happening in that third country along the way.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think just in general for 232s, like the reasoning behind in the proclamation why they are trying to implement tariffs across the board and getting rid of the country exemptions and exclusions is that obviously they want to reduce the number of imports coming in for steel and aluminum. They saw that there was an increase from countries where there was an exemptions that were provided. So in order to reduce but also boost up the domestic industry here and obviously mitigate the threat of national security, they are noticing that even for countries where tariffs apply, like for example China, they are transshipping or doing further processing in countries where there is an exemption, like Mexico, and those goods are coming into the U.S. So there is some sort of a loophole where they are not paying tariffs when they should be. So I think that's kind of like the reasoning behind why the exemptions on certain countries are going away, because they do not want to see countries that do have tariffs using these other countries with exemptions as a loophole or a transshipment location or further processing manufacturing being done in order to avoid the tariffs. All right. I know we're a little bit over. We will get to all the questions. We will reach out with answers for those ones that we didn't get to. But that concludes today's webinar. We will host another webinar in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that invite soon. A reminder to please share your feedback in the survey linked above. We will email everyone a link to the recording tomorrow morning. Thank you once again, and have a great day.